All right, welcome back, guys. If you're here, it's because you're interested in figuring out what was happening in the late 1800s in America and the ideas of reform. So today we're going to get through the early reforms in America. So we're talking about the late 1800s and early 1900s, and basically that time period is known as the Progressive Era. It's the time period where we made a lot of progress. So progress meant Americans now had to react to the problems by working for reform. Reform is going to be the fix. All right, so let's get it going. This should be pretty old for you. I showed you this before. If you didn't know it, lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. Part of reform was the women in America. There was a movement called the temperance movement to get rid of alcohol. So you'll see that again later on. So if you need the vocabulary, pause the screen, write down the vocab so you got it on your worksheet. If not, I'm going to keep moving. So what are the pressures for progressive reform? Well, the progressive era was really a reaction to a bunch of different things happening in America. And the first big one happened in the late 1800s. These powerful monopolies were really controlling prices, and they were raising prices and they were restricting competition. So if you broke the monopolies up, there would be more competition, prices for products would go down. There was tremendous amounts of labor unrest and violence. A lot of early labor strikes had happened, but the workers really didn't get a lot. So you're going to see them actually getting things during the progressive era. People were living in really unhealthy and unsafe living and working conditions. So that's bad. There was a huge gap between the living standards for the rich and the poor. The rich seemed to be getting really, really richer, and the poor were getting poorer. It was also known as the Gilded Age. So you see that vocab term, the Gilded Age? What was happening in cities? Tons of poverty, crime, too many people living in a small area, and little to no sanitation for in terms of drinking water and when we had to go to the bathroom and things like that. So the people who were running the cities were very corrupt, stealing a lot of money, and the government really wasn't responsive to the people's needs. And lastly, we were using too much of our natural resources, and we needed to develop some way in which to conserve them. So nothing really major here. These are all little things that lead to the progressive era for the ideas of reform. So let's take a look at business practices first and foremost. You should have learned this from the late 1800s, but corporations, large companies, are growing increasingly wealthy and very powerful, and really so powerful they were pretty much controlling the government, and the government left them alone for a while. The idea of the survival of the fittest kind of crept into people's minds, and if you were economically successful, it was only because that you had the ability to lead, and everybody should maybe leave you alone. And that term is called social Darwinism, and that was the explanation for why some people were rich and some people were poor. Well, simply just let society happen, and those people who succeed earn their position, they earn their money, and those people who failed really deserve to fail because they did it on their own. They didn't really do what they needed to do to make it in America. So social Darwinists believed in laissez-faire. Leave businesses alone. Government should not intervene and just let society happen. And some people will win and some people will lose. All right. So here would be like a kind of like an Andrew Carnegie looking character over here. This is really pretty much Charles Darwin. The idea of social Darwinism, right? Get out of my house, leave me alone. And that's the government's attitude. Laissez-faire, don't mess with them. Just let it happen. So if you need to know social Darwinism or laissez-faire for the worksheet, you got it. Let's take a look at factory workers here. And I use a lot of interchangeable terms when we go through this. So industrial workers are factory workers. Well, factory work was extremely harsh. It was very difficult. Laborers worked 60-hour weeks on machinery, 60 hours, sometimes 10, 12 hours a day. The conditions were extremely unsafe, unhealthy, and people were not making a lot of money. Wages were very low. You'll find that children and women were often hired. A lot of owners liked hiring them because you can pay them less money, right? Simple rule, if you got hurt and you couldn't work, they would find a replacement and you wouldn't get to work the next day. You'd be fired because simply you couldn't work, right? So if you didn't show up to work one day, you were pretty much fired, and now they got someone to fill your spot. There was simply no security. Employers could fire workers at any time. At will employment at its best. In some of the textile factories, the young girls would get fired for even talking. Yes. Employers fire workers for organizing labor unions, showing up to work late, talking. It was bad, right? Early strikes really fail. Private security guards and federal troops often intervene to break up the strikes. So when you look at that entire litany there, that whole list, industrial workers, not a good time period if you're working in a factory, all right? That's kind of giving you an example of the close-knit work people are doing. There's a lot of people working in a very small area. Accidents were very prominent. And obviously this is some type of textile mill. They're doing something with fabric here, right? Well, how are people living in a city? So you see that word urban, you're thinking cities, right? There's a huge gap already mentioned between the rich and the poor. You're never going to read a book about how the rich lived. You know how they lived. We're going to teach you how the poor people were living, all right? The rich had these large houses. They were safe. They had butlers and maids and people making their food, clean neighborhoods. Well, the poor were living in what we call slums, tremendous amounts of crime, too many people, very congested, and poor sanitation, right? So the housing in the cities was actually, they were segregated by how much money you made, your social and economic status. There were little pockets in cities like an Italian neighborhood and an Asian neighborhood and an Irish neighborhood. So it was basically segregated by the color of your skin and your ethnicity. So the money you made, what color your skin was, and your ethnicity. So what's the government doing about this? Well, let's find out. So there's a kind of a mixed response from the government at all levels, from the local levels to the state levels and to the federal levels. So government at all levels remained unresponsive. They weren't doing anything. Once again, laissez-faire. Industries were restrained by federal and state governments. Industries were unrestrained, meaning there were no rules. Those factory owners could do whatever they wanted. The courts, even when there was an issue brought up in courts, they ruled in favor of the businesses, simply to support the fair standards and let businesses do whatever they wanted. You got your laissez-faire, it was very prominent, and public received little help from their elected officials. So people, really needed to start helping themselves. We'll see some early cases here. What happened? I'll give you two of them. The first one is Lochner versus New York. We'll give you the issue and then why that court ruled how they ruled. Right? Well, New York law limited baker's workday was found unconstitutional. Why? Because the court said, hey, it interfered with private contracts. If there was simply a baker who was willing to work longer, he should be allowed to work longer. So they said, hey, that's hindering people's ability to make money. So really, they didn't put a minimum time period on how many hours people can work in a day, which really helped businesses because then they could say, hey, they can make you work whatever, right? Muller versus Oregon in 1908, there was an Oregon law that limited women to a 10-hour workday, and they said that law was constitutional. Now that one, we're going to limit the hours for women. Why? To protect their health. So some cases the government and the courts ruled for the workers, and in other cases they did not. So let's meet some people who are known as the progressives now. Progressives make up many different movements and many different Americans. It's just not one single person, not one single group. And the progressives as a whole are going to be the ones who are responsive to the people's needs. So they are going to attack all of the social wrongs in America. So that's who the progressives are, all right? So let's take a look at their characters. They're a progressive party. What are they looking at? A bunch of people, looks like families. You got workers, industrial workers. They want liberty. They want justice. They want equality for everybody. Not only going to help out one particular group, they're going to help out everybody. So mainly it's mostly the America's middle class who are involved in there. The lower classes simply don't have the time, effort, education to get involved in this movement. So you're going to see a lot of our progressive writers, photographers, and people are going to really emerge from our middle class, right? Well, what do they believe? What are the progressive goals? So they were optimists. They felt that life in America could be better, so we're going to work to make it better. They also believed that our government had many abuses, our government was corrupt, and that businesses actually could be stopped. If the government was responsible, businesses could be told what they can and can't do. They believe that new developments in technology and science could actually help society. We can clean up our water systems. We can clean up our sanitation. We can have a place to put garbage. And we can build better technology to make America enjoy a better life. Still believed in capitalism, but feared the growth of socialism. They did not want to move to a socialistic structure, but they felt that capitalism needed to be regulated. All right. They definitely wanted to bypass these party politics that played a role in the governmental corruption in the late 1800s, but they still had faith that a government could be strong, could be beneficial, right? They said that people and the government could and should fix any of the abuses that were wrong in society, and at the same time protect the rights of the people. So that just kind of gives you a window as to what the progressives believe. So we will see progress towards social and economic reform and consumer protection. So the progressives, once again, are going to deal with everything. There's a wide variety of reform in the late 1800s, early 1900s. That's your progressive era. All right, so let's meet some people. There's going to be a group of people known as muckrakers. If you're in class, you probably met them already. If not, here we go. Muckrakers are going to be the journalists, the writers, the artists, the photographers, the exposés. They're going to bring reform issues to the attention of the public. They're not going to fix it, but they're going to let you know the problems, and then they're going to rely on the government. They're going to rely on organizations to fix the issues, right? So what did they do? They investigated, they wrote, they exposed, they took pictures of the corruption and all injustices that were happening in America, all right? They wrote articles in magazines, they wrote novels and books, and we're going to meet a whole list of these people right here, right? So where did they get the name? The name came from Teddy Roosevelt, right? In these dark areas, you're not willing to look at that ugly stuff because you don't want to see it. Well, the muckrakers were willing to shine the light on it, rake it up, and then write about it to put it in front of your face. So if you need that vocabulary for the muckrakers, there you go. Take a peek at the progressive era muckrakers. If you're in a U.S. history class and you don't know who these people are, pay close attention to who they are right now. You'll be good to go. You'll be better for it, right? Well, Frank Norris wrote a book called The Octopus. He exposed the corrupt railroad practices and how they were hurting farmers by raising prices. Great story, The Octopus, read it, right? Ida Tarbell in McClure's magazine wrote about the history of Standard Oil. She exposed what a trust was. She exposed that form of monopoly, and it led to, the government really using the Sherman Antitrust Act to break trust up. Lincoln Steffens wrote a fantastic book known as The Shame of the Cities. It is about guys like Boss Tweed. It's about politicians who are corrupt. They're stealing money when they should be addressing the city's problems. Jacob Riis used flash photography. He took pictures of the poor in New York City in those tenements and those apartment buildings. And his book, of course, was How the Other Half Lives. And some people are mad. They say he miswrote his book. It should be How the Other 90% Were Living, right? And then probably the most famous muckraker that kids always remember is Upton Sinclair. He wrote a book known as The Jungle, and that was about the Chicago meatpacking industry and the unsanitary foods that were being produced at that time. So you may want to kind of study that slide if you need to and fill out your sheets so you're ready to go. All those guys, one or two of those guys will show up somewhere on like a test or an exam. Okay, what are some other areas of concern? Well, let's deal with the poverty that we're having in these cities, right? There are attempts to end poverty. What are the issues? The overcrowding and disease are in there, right? Once people understood germs, well, we began to fix the issues. Well, two issues we got. Number one, the water that people were drinking was tainted, and that was getting them sick. So we want to sanitize that and make sure that the water is safe. And the other issue was a lot of these older cities did not have running sewers. So people would go to the bathroom and it would end up all over the place. And then you know what happens? Yeah, that stuff gets in the drinking water and you're drinking that. So that stuff needed to be fixed, right? Well, what helped with that? Jacob Riis was an urban reformer, a city reformer, and he's used his writings to show those images. And once that information got out there, people decided it was time to what's the fix? We need to create building codes. We need to create better ventilated areas in these apartment buildings, better lighting, safer living conditions, and more sanitary living conditions. So what else is going to be behind that is your churches and your local organizations who say, hey, if you need help, we're willing to help. And once we have all these things, in terms of the sanitary living and the better the building codes, we end up with not as many people who are getting sick because we fixed the problem. So this just gives you an idea of some of the pictures that Jacob Reese took. I mean, kids living or sleeping in an alleyway, wintertime, no shoes. It's just bad. I mean, it's just tough to even look at those images, right? What else is going on? We have a huge immigrant population, and our immigrants need help. So if you ever see the settlement movement or settlement houses, immigrants came here and they needed places to settle. Well, here's your settlement movement, right? Settlement houses were located in the working class slums in the cities like Chicago and New York City, and they're going to help immigrants. Well, immigrants needed help with what? Learning English, getting education, maybe watching the children while the immigrant goes to work. Different social activities happen within these settlement houses, and it really just helped the immigrants in whatever way that they needed, right? The Hull House in Chicago, founded by Jane Addams, don't ever spell her name wrong, it's two D's, Jane Addams, is one of the most famous settlement houses. But realize it wasn't just happening in Chicago, it happened in the other cities as well, right? If you go to New York City, you're going to find Henry Street by Lillian Wald. So you can find examples of these settlement houses in every major city from New York all the way up to the Mississippi River there. So there's also a little, oh, there it is right there. So if you go to Chicago, Stewart Settlement House, there you go, Gary's Black Community, you got it in there, right? Other areas of concern, there was a lot of people who saw the crime, and there was a peace movement during the Progressive era. Not a large thing, but it's there, right? Jane Addams and the Little were among the Americans who led these peace groups. Well, what are they? Mostly women's organizations who supported pacifism, anti-war, anti-fighting, right? So if you don't know what pacifism is, think about the Quakers from the colonial days, right? Policy of they opposed war, they opposed fighting. Jane Addams actually won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. Don't forget, she had to live, and the Americans had to make it through World War I, and we ended up trying to stay out of World War II, right? So there they are, a bunch of women getting together. Jane Addams, there it is, they're for peace, right? All right. Temperance, a name that you should have been kind of aware of, but if you forgot it, it gets brought up again. We last learned about the temperance movement in the early 1800s. It was part of the reform from the early 1800s around the Jacksonian era there, and they're still pushing for it. So temperance movement is simply the opposition to use alcohol. So, I mean, these are women, mostly women, who want to get together to get rid of alcohol. So the goal here was what's known as prohibition. So temperance is the movement, and they're pushing for prohibition, which is what? Outlawing the manufacture and the sale of alcohol. By the way, it will happen with the 18th Amendment, right? Well, what's their organization? They're known as the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU. Their leader was Frances Willard. She created these anti-saloon leagues, which really pushed for prohibition, wanted people to close down bars and get the government to make those places illegal. Well, eventually we do end up with the 18th Amendment, which says you cannot transport it, drink it, sell it, have it, make it, anything. And you'll see that amendment come around right around in 1919, ratified, put together in 1920. So the goal is to get rid of the alcohol, and they actually do it with the 18th Amendment, right? So there's a little pledge card. If you wanted to join their organization, you might say, hey, yes, I believe in this. I like it. I'm going to tell all my neighbors about it, right? The Women Christians Temperance Union. You see that, right? And there you go. It's the WCTU. Don't forget that group, right? Oh, help me keep them pure, right? So what is she saying? She doesn't want her child exposed to alcohol, so please vote against what? The sale of liquor. So if you get rid of it, my child will never be exposed to that, right? Carrie Nate, she went around like closing bars and breaking bottles of booze and everything. She was crazy. Men are nicotine-soaked, beer-besmirched, whiskey-greased, red-eyed devils. She didn't like men who drank. Let's put it that way, right? If you need the vocabulary, you can pause it. I'm going to keep cruising here for you. Other areas of reform. Let's talk about the kids. Kids at that time were allowed to go to work. They were working in factories. They weren't going to schools, they were going to work. So by 1904, there was a National Child Labor Committee. There was formed. They recognized the freedom to contract verdict in Lochner v. New York. Remember that Baker said, "Hey man, yeah, you can work, you can work as much as you want, right?" A lobbied the federal government to create the Federal Children's Bureau in 1912, which the federal government finally did. They began to investigate kids working in factories. I'm not talking about kids like 12, 13 years old. I'm talking about kids 7, 8 years old, right? Set minimum wage and maximum work hours for children. So that is progressive, right? We're going to say, hey, this group of people needs to be at school. They don't need to be working in a factory, right? So you have the National Child Labor Committee. Why? 2 million children workers under 16 years today. So they're out there working. They don't want to stop it. That's progressive, right? Let's talk about the women, right? Women are going to be extremely involved during the progressive era, right? So they're involved in all aspects of all the social reforms that were happening. But the main goal for women was what? It was suffrage, all right? Women wanted the right to vote. They did not get it yet, all right? So let's just kind of recap the women's suffrage movement for you. Well, what do we know? It began in 1848. Seneca Falls, you remember it. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was there. They wrote a document. It was the Declaration of Sentiments, and they basically put it all on the table. And they said, we really want the right to vote. Well, Susan B. Anthony also joined the movement by the 1850s. Lucretia Mott, we know the names. But by the 1860s, the movement kind of splits. So what you have here is you have this radical organization led by Stanton and Anthony, and they're really pressuring, they're pushing. And then you have this more moderate organization led by Lucy Stone, Henry Blackwell, and they're like, hey, it's going to happen, we're going to work towards it, but we're not going to push anybody's buttons, right? Well, by 1890, the groups merged. Again, they came back together to form NASA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, all right? And that's NASA. And actually, there'll be another split after this. But, realize, what are you finding out about movements? Look at the years here, 1848, 1860s, 1890s. They're still pushing for the right to vote, and they don't have it yet, right? So there it is, National American Women's Suffrage Association, NASA. There it is again. It's just showing you more. If you ever see a picture of one of these women with these little sashes on, it was kind of known in the late early 1900s. If you were willing to wear that sash like that, you were called a suffragette, which meant you were a woman who was pushing for the right to vote, right? Well, what happens in the movement? By 1902, Elizabeth Cady Stanton dies. Susan B. Anthony dies. So Carrie Chapman Catt becomes kind of the leader of this group that really wants the right to vote. And she's going to pressure our government officials to create a constitutional amendment. So here's what she wants. She wants an amendment saying that women have the right to vote. She's going to do it 2 ways. She's going to hopefully go state by state to get enough states to vote for it. If not, she's going to pretty much ask Congress to do it. So she's trying. She's working towards it, right? Well, Alice Paul, kind of the younger generation, right? She led a more militant, what's called Congressional Union. She was expelled by NASA. She forms her own National Women's Party. And Alice Paul was willing to picket the president, boycott the president, picket in front of the White House. And she gave some women a bad name. Some women didn't like she was doing too much. But, hey, she was in the movement. She was part of it. And, all together, all of these great women really finally led to what? In 1920, the 19th Amendment finally was ratified, granting all women the right to vote. So I know that there was 3-4 slides. There's a lot. So there's a lot of information on women's suffrage. So you might want to go back and make sure you study that stuff, right? This is just showing you state by state who allowed women the right to vote. So look at all these other Western states. They gave full suffrage to women early on. Wyoming was the first state, 1869. These states right here, these black states, there was no suffrage until the federal government told them that women were allowed to vote in 1920. So that's when all those other states got it, right? Vocab, suffrage, got to know it. Suffrage simply means the right to vote. Well, suffragists, or if you see a suffragette, that is a woman who wants the right to vote. Pretty easy. Let's talk about some education for women and kind of wrap up this this early part of the progressive era. Educational opportunities began to grow for women in the late 1800s. You're going to see them down here, right? You're going to find that there's actually women's colleges only for women. Vassar, Smith College, right? These are only female colleges back in the late 1860s, 1870s. By the early 1900s, 1/3 of those attending colleges were actually women. So it's not even, but we're getting better. That's reform. That's progressive, right? Also, women who wanted control, they also wanted control of their body. So Margaret Sanger, she was a nurse, cared for immigrants in New York City. She felt that women were having too many babies. So the only way to combat that would be to set up little birth control clinics and teach women about their body, about their cycle. And she founds an organization known as the American Birth Control League, basically led to become what's today Planned Parenthood, and eventually the development of the pill. So women could actually have what's called a birth control pill. You can control whether you have a child or not, right? Last group of people, well, there she is, Margaret. No woman can call herself free who does not control her own body. Margaret Sanger, phenomenal woman, right? Let's take a look about African Americans during the progressive era, and then we can wrap this up for you. Obviously, the rights of African Americans were really being distinguished ever since they got them right after the Civil War. So if you don't remember, let me take it back for that, all right? Decades following the Civil War, very difficult time for African Americans. There were simply laws that were created by southern states that prevented African Americans from exercising their right to vote. Poll taxes and literacy tests are two prime examples. If you didn't have money to pay the poll tax, you can't vote. If you couldn't pass that literacy test, they didn't allow you to vote, right? Well, what else was happening down south was known as Jim Crow laws, which segregated society in terms of separate bathrooms, separate facilities, separate theaters, separate public parks, separate schools, separate, right? And it was legal because the Supreme Court declared segregation legal in Plessy versus Ferguson. So, black people can't vote, black people being separated, it is legal, that separation is legal, and the white mobs killed hundreds of African Americans after the Civil War by lynching. So there's a lot of issues down here that need to be addressed, and some of them begin to be addressed during the progressive era. So we're going to take a look at two phenomenal African Americans here, right? These are our leaders. They work to secure the rights for all African Americans. First guy is Booker T. Washington, was a former slave. He saw society change. He founded an institution so black people can get their education, known as the Tuskegee Institute. He urged African Americans to get training, become carpenters, become plumbers, get a trade, go to work, and that will boost your self-esteem. You will gain respect, and the white man will respect you because you are showing you have worth. Just be a good person, get some training, go to work. Things will end up being okay. It's a good strategy. It does work. It just takes time. Another gentleman known as W.E.B. Du Bois didn't want to wait that long. Okay, so he is also going to do the same thing as Booker T. Washington, except he's going to go about it a different way. He is a very educated person. He felt African Americans should protest any unfair treatment, anything that's not right in society. And you should not, don't worry about that vocation. Don't worry about just being a carpenter. You should go to college, get a broad liberal education, and then show them that you're equal. In 1905, he founded the Niagara Movement that really didn't take off. A couple hundred members, and it really didn't become what he thought it would. But the Niagara Movement will kind of die out, but become something else. And that becomes the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That is the NAACP. That organization fought extremely hard for African American rights. And let me tell you something, that organization is still around today, right? So there's W.E.B. Du Bois. Education is the whole system of human training within and without schoolhouse walls, which molds and develops men. So he said, if you want to go be a plumber, that's great, but you should also really get an education, and that's going to get you where you want to go, all right? Slightly different. Another gentleman named Marcus Garvey. He founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association. He was a nationalist, and he said it kind of a separatist group, and he advocated for a separate African American economy. He said African Americans should only help themselves and encourage African Americans to get out of America. He said you're never going to be treated equally, so the only thing to do is move back to what? Africa. So his kind of movement was the Back to Africa movement. Doesn't really get widespread clout, but some people were involved in that, and they actually went back to Africa. We should say the millions who are in Africa to hold the fort. We are coming. We're going to come back. So he basically encouraged the 400 million African Americans to just come together back in Africa, and it kind of didn't happen, right? Ida B. Wells, you should know this lady. If not, she wrote an incredible book. She gave speeches around the country on behalf of the lynchings that were happening for white men, for black men, black women down south. She really put it out there. She was a journalist, lifelong national crusade against the lynchings. She took pictures, she wrote the books, she gave the speeches, she put it out there. She said, we are not going to hide this, we're going to let you know about it so you fix it, right? She was definitely a suffragette. She wanted the right to vote, and one of the founders of the NAACP. There's Ida B. Wells, Southern Horrors. What is she writing about? Lynch law, right? She wanted one, she wanted the government to do it, right? The only way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. So we're not going to hide the ugliness. We're going to put it right out there. So you can kind of add her, if you wanted to your list of muckrakers. I would definitely call her a muckraker, right? So the last little piece here, rights of others facing discrimination. Well, there are definitely other minority groups in America in the late early 1900s who are not being treated equally. And one of them is going to be the Jewish group. So in 1913, a group of American Jews formed what they called the Anti-Defamation League. And the league worked to simply combat what they were facing. Well, what are they facing? People would talk bad about them. They would say bad things about them simply because they were Jewish. All right. Later, the program was broadened to help the civil liberties of all Americans. The Anti-Defamation League really helps out all minorities today, but it started out to only help out one specific group that felt they weren't being treated equally, and that would be our Jewish brethren that are out there. So when you go through and you really look at the progressive era, there are a lot of problems, so we need a lot of reforms to fix them. So stay tuned. There'll be a couple videos coming up on presidential progressivism and the rest of the movement. So good luck. Go back, watch this again if you need it, and we'll see you soon.